In the quiet shuffle of dusty boots and dry wind, there stood a building that never advertised but always had customers. It didn't sprout steeples or law offices or brass registers. It offered no sermons, no banknotes, and rarely, if ever, a witness willing to talk. Yet this was the heart of the Old West, beating behind lace curtains and creaking floorboards. Brothels. Now, I know what you're thinking. Weren't those places just dens of sin and scandal? Well, yes. But also, not just that. You see, the story of the American West is rarely about the sheriff. The real local authorities were women named Pearl, Frenchie, or sometimes just Madam Something. And instead of badges, they had ledgers, contacts, and enough political goodwill to make any mayor blush. But let's not rush. Let's slow the boots down. We've got a long trail ahead, and this trail starts with porridge. Yes, porridge. In the early frontier towns, those wooden-walled sprigs of civilization strained. Through whiskey and weather, decent hot food was harder to find than a sober poker player. Yet, in these brothels, there was porridge. Oats, sometimes with cinnamon, cooked by a woman who also knew how to track a bank wagon better than most sheriffs. Brothels in many western towns were open early in the morning. Not just for obvious reasons, but because they served hot breakfast. They had proper bathtubs, big porcelain affairs when most houses had tin washtubs. They had fresh linens. And they had women who knew the inside workings of cattle contracts, lumber deals, and railroad expansions, because the men who did the talking also did the spending, and they talked freely inside satin-curtained rooms. A lot of decisions were made at the bar, but even more were made quietly at Miss Clementine's over eggs and discreet bourbon. See, the thing most people don't realize is that in towns like Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone, brothels were banks of information. Their madams doubled as unofficial mayors, funding schoolhouses, hospitals, and newspapers, because they had both the resources and the motivation to keep the towns from devolving completely into dust and duel. Why? Because brothels were businesses, successful ones. They needed a functioning town to function themselves. So when miners got hurt, it was often the local madam who paid for a doctor. When a schoolteacher's pay didn't come in, it was sometimes a discreet envelope of coins, quietly slipped through a church door that kept her in chalk. The so-called sporting ladies also laid the foundations, literally, for plumbing in many western towns. See, when you house multiple people, cleanliness isn't a luxury, it's survival. So brothels installed things like running water, sewage lines, and even electricity, often before the jailhouse did. And naturally, once you've wired up a parlor with light bulbs, you'd be amazed at how swift the town council is to install it on Main Street, eventually claiming it was their idea all along. Politicians, of course, needed discretion even more than warmth or whiskey, so brothels became safe houses for secrets, both harmless and, well, history prefers not to mention. But let's just say if someone went missing and the madam had nothing to say about it, she almost certainly knew everything. And let's not forget the women themselves. Some were trafficked, yes, a terrible reality of the era. But many were travelers, immigrants and widows, seeking independence in the only economy that didn't care if you had a husband, diploma, or permission. Some madams went on to own vast properties, influence elections, and even loan money to mayors, at competitive interest rates too. In a land where you couldn't always trust the preacher or the barkeep, town stability often sat in a chair upholstered in red velvet, pouring tea, and offering unsolicited but suspiciously effective advice to visiting lawmen. So maybe, just maybe, the most powerful building in town wasn't the jail or the general store. It was the quiet house with the pink slatted shutters and the best porridge in 5 counties. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let's gently drift onward, where deeper secrets wait behind swinging doors and soft laughter. If you were to close your eyes and picture the American frontier, what do you see? Maybe a dusty saloon with doors that swing like gossip. Cowboys clinking glasses of something much stronger than common sense. Horses snorting outside, confused as to why no one ever built decent parking for them. And somewhere, behind a slightly too-curtained window above the general store, a flicker of something less spoken about. The soft glow of a brothel lamp, redder than respectability, but flickering more dependably than the town's single streetlight. But before we get there, we begin in mud. Post-Civil War, America was a sprawling experiment in, well, let's see what happens if we just move west. With railroads outracing politicians and settlers sinking roots wherever the ground didn't actively bite them, towns popped up overnight like wild mushrooms, shifty, stubborn, and usually surrounded by at least one man claiming he owned the whole place. Most of these rough-and-tumble boomtowns had three things by week 2: a saloon, a jail badly in need of business, and a ladies' establishment referred to, with creative discretion, as fancy. Now the word brothel may evoke notions of scandal, sin, or salacious smirks, but in 19th century frontier towns, these establishments weren't the side act. They were often the main operation. It started, as things often do, with money. The average cowboy, miner, or foolish gold panner worked long, dusty days with few thrills beyond the occasional fistfight over a misunderstood card trick. When payday struck, they had two desires. One was to lose their wage somewhere dramatic, and the other was to not be alone that night. Brothels, equipped with velvet lamps, music that hovered pleasantly out of tune, and women with names like Crystal, Ruby, or Pearl, real names, Mildred, Bertha, and Ethel, were happy to oblige. They offered more than just company. They offered a fantasy. And home-cooked stew. See, most Western brothels functioned more like badly branded country inns. A fella could stop in for a warm meal, hear the latest gossip, get patched up if the sheriff failed at non-violence again, and even find a kind ear to talk to. At a price, of course. But this wasn't just a service. It was a business model more successfully vertical than any of their competitors. While the preacher passed the plate and the blacksmith passed out from heatstroke, brothel madams were meticulously reinvesting. They bought land. They hired musicians. They funded fire brigades. Some even paid the town doctor's bills so their employees, and occasionally their customers, didn't perish before the next social function. Often, the madam of the town's most decorative business was also quietly funding its schoolhouse or loaning the mayor money he couldn't admit he needed. And here's the twist. These madams weren't characters in some risque novel. They were sharp, pragmatic businesswomen in an era where most women couldn't legally own things, vote, or speak too loudly in public without being handed unsolicited advice about fainting couches. Take, for example, Belle Brezing, a Kentucky madam with taste, tact, and the addictive self-confidence of someone who knew exactly how much she was owed. Her house was so prominent that even the Queen of England supposedly inquired about her abilities. Not her specific abilities, mind you, but about how she ran such an efficient house. Belle kept ledgers more accurate than the town bank, and her girls dressed finer than most preachers' wives, which did shake a few hymnals. Or Madame Julia Bulette of Virginia City, Nevada. Loved by the miners and tolerated by the local authorities until someone realized she donated more to the fire department than the county did. When tragedy ended her story, the mourning rivaled that of regional politicians. Streets went quiet for her, something rarely achieved unless the saloon ran out of whiskey. The power of brothels lay not just in their economy, but in their community. Frontier life was brutal, dirty, and often heartbreakingly short. The so-called fallen women of the West were not falling, really. They were surviving, flourishing even, and many found in these houses a kind of agency rarely extended elsewhere. And yes, they had politics too. In more than one case, these establishments determined local elections. Don't be too shocked. Democracy has always been a little drunk in a corset. Now nestled beneath gas lamps and a cloak of desert silence, with the fireflies of history flickering gently by. Imagine the creak of a wooden floor above a moonlit saloon, where a brothel madam counts wages like a banker, governs like a senator, and schedules a bath for precisely $2.15, which cost extra if you wanted hot water. But of course, no madam ran the town alone. She had help, and not just from the women behind those velvet curtains either. There was someone else, someone behind the scenes with a clipboard and a mildly threatening smile. If you've ever stepped into a frontier town, at least in your imagination, and caught sight of creaky wooden sidewalks, clinking whiskey glasses, and that endless swirl of desert dust, you might have imagined a sheriff, a saloon, a blacksmith, and maybe a mysterious establishment with red curtains and a softly flickering lantern out front. It's easy to picture the brothel as a backdrop, a flamboyant footnote in the great dusty saga of the West. But, as we're about to quietly reveal, it was really more of a velvet-threaded backbone. And perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the curious case of municipal finances. You see, while towns were springing up like tumbleweed pop-up shops, actual economic structures were a bit scarce. Many towns didn't have the tax base to afford little luxuries like roads, schools, or someone to remove possums from the general store's ceiling. Enter the women of the brothel, not just as entertainers or businesswomen, but as nonchalant economic powerhouses. First, there were the fines. Oh yes. Most brothels were technically, officially, municipally frowned upon, which meant they were fined, routinely, predictably, strategically, and very, very financially beneficially. These fines weren't paid begrudgingly, no, they were practically scheduled. Often, madams would stride into town hall like they were dropping off muffins. "Here's this month's public nuisance fee," they'd say, smiling warmly, having nuisanced rather lucratively the night before. And towns loved it. Those fines paid for street lamps, jail cells, and the occasional holiday bunting. There are records in several Western towns showing that up to half the city's revenue came from fines on vice. And of all the vices in the rickety wooden bucket, brothels were by far the most consistent depositors. But it wasn't just fines. There were business licenses, liquor permits, and personal property taxes, all things the brothel was all too happy to pay. While the local bank might close if the stagecoach was late, Miss Lillian's house of gentle conversation was always ready to pay, in full, in gold coin or polite sarcasm. Now, let's take a moment to zoom into a town like Deadwood. Oh yes, with a name like that, how could we not? Deadwood knew its identity. It was raw-boned and boomtowned, slathered in gold dust, and bathed in questionable decisions. And brothels. They didn't just prop up the town, they practically upholstered it. Pamela Parker, a madam of considerable means and considerable mustache, true story, and quite dashing, ran her establishment like a fortress of fiscal elegance. Not only did she employ dozens of women, but she also contracted local vendors for linens, candles, and fresh gooseberries, unexpectedly popular in bordello desserts. Go figure. She paid her taxes promptly and employed a security guard who doubled as the town's informal poet. Because in the Wild West, job descriptions were often more of a suggestion than a rule. Pamela wasn't alone. Across the West, madams became unofficial sponsors of fire brigades, church roof repairs, and local orphanages. Ironically, or perhaps poetically, these women, operating in the shadows of propriety, were keeping the town from collapsing into literal dust. And townspeople knew it. While publicly the brothel might be regarded with pursed lips and lace-clad gasps, privately, everyone understood. You needed blankets for the winter? Talk to the madam. You wanted the town square swept before Founders Day? There's a lady with a ledger who could arrange that. Some even served on town planning committees, anonymously at times, but decisively. Because when you quietly bankroll most of the town's improvements, you earn a certain leverage. Nothing too flashy, just enough to ensure the water pump was fixed before the mayor's chickens discovered their wings again. Of course, not everyone was on board. There were reformers, temperance groups, and stern men with moral pamphlets. But even they struggled to explain why the streets gleamed only after a vice crackdown had been politely delayed. And so, in the quiet flicker of gaslight, and under the seemingly innocent hum of a player piano, brothels didn't just contribute to the town. They massaged its economy, softened its rough edges, and Eekshuld turned giddy weekend binges into long-term infrastructure plans. Not bad for an industry that liked to stay out of the spotlight, except, of course, on Friday nights. And as the lamps dimmed on Main Street, and the town accountant raised a glass to another well-balanced year, somewhere behind those red curtains, someone was balancing far more than a checkbook. Next, we'll wander through swinging doors and spangled decor to explore who exactly these women were. Behind the lace, beyond the ledger, with a few surprising resumes tucked neatly between the feather boas and the bookkeeping, the old West streets didn't just echo with the click of spurred boots and the wheeze of saloon doors drifting shut on a hot afternoon. There's another sound, quieter but far more powerful, the rustle of coin purses being handed over in the discreet parlors of the local brothel. You see, in the dry, often dust-swept towns stretching across New Mexico, Colorado, and the Dakota territories, prosperity was an elusive animal, and brothels had a way of lassoing it to their front porch. Now, before you drift into thinking that all parlors were dim rooms filled with lace lampshades and sin, it's worth noting, a bordello in the Old West could be one of the most organized, business-savvy parts of town. Some functioned with more precision than a bank, and in many ways that's just what they were, a kind of emotional and economic bank, making deposits in the town psyche and quiet withdrawals from the men's wallets. Some of the more established madams, such as the formidable Mattie Silks or the enchantingly terrifying Dora Dufran, ran operations that would make a modern startup sweat. Investment portfolios? No, but they had real estate holdings. Strategic planning meetings? No flip charts, but every third Wednesday over tea and whiskey. They managed employees, handled security. In a time before Yelp reviews, reputation management took a revolver and firm etiquette, and knew the sweet science of leverage, particularly over the sheriff who may or may not have owed them money. You might say that these were women who wore corsets by day and invisible business suits by night. The madam was more than a keeper of secrets. She was an influencer before there were hashtags. Her establishment had sway with everyone from the town doctor to, you guessed it, the mayor. In many towns, she quite literally was the bank. Need a loan? Can't pay the feed store? The madam might spot you some cash, provided you'd help make sure her liquor shipments arrived unimpeded and that the fines for disorderly establishments got mysteriously lost in the paperwork. She ran payroll on time, always. And frankly, half the saloons wouldn't have been able to make their own if she hadn't kept their clientele entertained or distracted. That's why many barkeeps offered discreet discounts to her girls and ensured that chairs were discreetly polished and bar tabs mysteriously adjusted in their favor. It was the Wild West form of corporate benefits. And if you were a new arrival to town, with dust in your hair and a lost look in your eyes, the brothel might be the first place you found directions that made any sense. These women had seen everything: gold rushes, land grabs, claim jumpers, snake oil salesmen, and that guy Frank, who kept proposing despite forgetting his own name half the time. If you needed to know where to get provisions or how to avoid the drunk constable named Clem, the madam or one of her sharp-eyed girls could quietly steer you straight. Of course, all this required a certain discretion. Brothels often moved within a twilight of legality. On the books, many were classified as boarding houses or entertainment halls. The more optimistic towns tried euphemisms like female employment centers. But the signage didn't fool anyone. The tall, narrow windows draped in velvet curtains and the piano that played only after sundown told the full story. And if there was ever fire damage, the brothel, oddly enough, was first to rebuild. Insurance companies might hesitate to fund a livery stable or the dry goods store, but the brothel had private capital stacked beneath the floorboards, often literally in little tin boxes. Their speed in restoring business operations was nothing short of miraculous. In fact, after the Great Fire of Prescott, Arizona, in 1900, the town's reputable businesses were still in ashes, while one particular brothel had already restocked its wine cellar and sent engraved invitations to its most loyal patrons by sundown the following day. Because time, after all, was money. And if there's one thing the madam respected, it was a good return on investment. Whiskey waits for no woman, and neither did business. And though they kept to the shadows of the social register, these women were reshaping the frontier. One nod, wink, and cleverly negotiated real estate deal at a time. Their fingers were on the pulse of power, even if polite society pretended not to notice. Let's walk a little further into town, shall we? Past the dusty general store and the newspaper office that kept forgetting to mention brothels in its stories. There's something stirring in the politics of the dusty streets, a velvet-gloved hand nudging elections and town ordinances from behind a lace curtain. As the frontier towns of the American West yawned into existence, somewhere between one saloon and 18, the brothel often arrived not like a scandal or a sin, but like plumbing. Utterly necessary, a little messy, and just close enough to civilization to be tolerated. In dusty junctions with names like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Whiskey Creek, because of course there was a Whiskey Creek, these establishments were typically housed above or behind the local saloon, which was itself often the only building built from something more ambitious than scraps someone left behind after a minor explosion. The brothel might go by any number of euphemisms: parlor house, boarding house, or, if the madam had a sense for melodrama, the house of delight. But make no mistake, everyone and their horses knew what went on in there. Now, here's where it gets more interesting than a cowboy's sock drawer. These so-called houses of ill repute were often, paradoxically, the best-run businesses in town. While the general store might be out of beans and the bank might be out of money, the local brothel could be counted on to have clean sheets, predictable hours, and, strangely enough, a surprisingly robust line of credit. Much of that came down to the madams. These women were not simply keeping the lamps trimmed and the whiskey watered. They were businesswomen, investors, community donors, and often the only people in town who had a full account book and could spell arithmetic without sounding it out slowly. In many places, the madam was the richest person west of the creek, and sometimes east of it too. One Miss Mattie Silks of Denver, for instance, ran her operations with the elegance of a baroness and the sharpness of a porcupine in a corset. Not only did she manage multiple properties, she was known to wager on horses, sponsor boxing matches, and lend startup money to local shopkeepers. Legend has it, she once engaged in a horse and buggy duel with another madam named Katie Fulton over a slight involving a gentleman caller. Shots were fired, though it's possible they were more for show than for aim. One, after all, must maintain appearances. In fact, these women often purchased and maintained some of the most architecturally sturdy buildings in town, purely because they had to withstand both moral outrage and the wind. A brothel couldn't operate if the roof gave out every time the piano player hit a high note. When fire inevitably swept through the average frontier town, which it did, regularly because many of the structures were built from ambition and splinters, it was common for the brothel to be among the first to rebuild. Sometimes it was the only building left standing, blinking smoke from its shutters like a weary opera singer who's simply too used to drama. The presence of these establishments also made a peculiar kind of economic sense. They provided employment, fueled the economy, and attracted out-of-towners eager to part with their money in record time. Some prospectors would ride 50 miles for the chance to have a drink, a bath, and a chat with a woman who could recite Shakespeare while wearing feathers. That, my friend, is culture, frontier style. So while local preachers might thump their pulpits, and issue stern warnings about the fires of temptation, the town council was often perfectly happy to collect the taxes, property fees, and generous donations that conveniently arrived in envelopes with no return address. What's more, these houses often offered services beyond the expected. Medical assistance, for instance. Some brothels employed women with rudimentary nursing skills, rudimentary being a polite way of saying better than the blacksmith, worse than a drunk vet. During outbreaks of typhoid or influenza, it was not unheard of for the women of the brothel to become impromptu caregivers when others had long since bolted. As nighttime settled over the rough-hewn roofs and creaky wooden sidewalks of these young towns, lanterns would glow warmly behind lace curtains, and the soft sounds of laughter might drift out into the cool desert air. Commerce, care, companionship. Not always in that order. And it was always the brothel that stayed open late, when the general store had long shuttered, and the deputy was asleep with his badge in his shirt pocket. And somewhere, up in the well-appointed room of a madam who knew the value of a polished mirror and a well-timed donation, plans were quietly being made about land, about lawmen, and about the new preacher who'd arrived with fiery sermons and unpaid bar tabs. Because in the Old West, if you really wanted to know what was going on, you asked the woman who lit the last lamp at night. Let us linger now in the glow of that lamp and drift further into the shadows of how these unconventional establishments became the unspoken seat of power. In the glow of dim lamplight and creaky floorboards perfumed with pipe smoke and rosewater, the brothel wasn't just a haven of silk and secrets. It was the unofficial town hall, treasury, and on a few occasions, the provider of emergency dentistry. You see, in many Old West towns, particularly those hatched seemingly overnight during gold rushes, silver booms, and ambitious rail spurs, there wasn't much in the way of infrastructure, or rules, or honestly, plumbing. But there was always a brothel. Not just because lonely prospectors and itinerant cowhands had predictable appetites, but because these establishments often made more money than the saloons, general stores, and, let's face it, some banks. With money comes influence, and with influence comes the peculiar reality that the person in the best velvet dress in town might quietly wield more sway than the guy wearing the tin star. Madams, the women who ran these establishments, were often some of the wealthiest and most informed individuals in the territory. They knew things. Who was riding through? Who lost their shirt at last night's poker game? Whose cattle mysteriously disappeared during the storm last week? Secrets filtered through lacy curtains as easily as whiskey slid into crystal glasses. Now, many of these women weren't your stereotypical saloon girls brought to life from sticky-floored westerns. They were sharp, strategic, and often the heads of logistical empires. They juggled budgets, managed rosters, greased the palms of local officials, sometimes quite literally, and always kept a little black ledger in a drawer that no one dared open. Information was currency, and well-run brothels were the Federal Reserve of small-town gossip. Take, for instance, Julia Bulette of Virginia City, Nevada. Elegant, famously generous, and as sharp as a cactus spine in a lace glove, she was one of the few women whom city officials took very seriously. They didn't have much choice. She paid taxes, more than some mining companies. When the volunteer fire department needed funding, Julia was there. When the town needed supplies during an outbreak, her girls pitched in. Ladies of the evening, yes, but also unsung heroines of daylight logistics. Even lawmen found themselves dependent on madams, not just for sanctuary after a particularly spicy poker night, but for practical matters. As jails refused to maintain themselves, and marshals were often better at swinging fists than balancing books, it was the women behind the brothel curtains who made sure money moved where it needed to. Need new school supplies for the dusty little classroom near the edge of Deadwood? Prepare to thank Miss Delilah before the local board of anything gets the credit. They also dealt in diplomacy. See, when a town runs on tension between miners and merchants, Newcomers and old hands, law and free spirit, the brothel could act as neutral territory, a kind of candlelit Geneva. Deals were brokered over brandy, feuds softened under featherbeds and half-whispered promises. Real estate was traded with a wink. Someone was always owed a favor, and the brothel was well positioned to collect on kindness. It wasn't all elegance, of course. Sometimes running a brothel in the dust-choked West was part theatre, part triage. When the town doctor had one too many at the saloon, it was the madam who knew how to stitch a wound, cool a fever, or mix a hangover remedy that could bring a gambler back from the dead, or at least back to the blackjack table. Even when new preachers rolled into town, preaching about sin and eternal consequences, many had to pass by the very building whose charitable donation had paid to rebuild the church roof after last year's lightning mishap. The ironies, much like the corsetry, ran tight and deep. So yes, beneath the perfume, red velvet, an occasional suspicious giggle, these women had ledger books inked in numbers and notes, and an impressive ability to make the whole town run, mostly on time, usually without too much gunfire. And as the sun dipped below the prairie, and lanterns flickered to life in windows high above the street, it was often in those third-floor parlors, walls lined with the plush hush of velvet and the gentle tinkle of piano notes, that tomorrow's politics, business ventures and festivals were quietly arranged. Some called it scandal. Others called it survival. But in truth, it was administration in corset form, and in the silence that settled afterward, when cards were folded and the piano drifted into lullaby, even the most upstanding men in town could be seen tipping their hats not in judgment, but in quiet recognition. After all, they knew exactly who made the town work. But where did all that money go when it changed hands in dimly lit rooms and moon-soaked hallways? Well, the answer, my sleepy pioneer, lies just a few doors down. Pull up those covers. We're not done dreaming just yet. By the soft flicker of oil lamps and the creak of wooden floorboards, another world stirred to life just as most townsfolk settled under patched quilts for the night. The parlors of old West brothels weren't mere dens of scandal and whiskey, I regret. They were, strange as it may sound, some of the most effective financial institutions west of the Mississippi. Here's the sleepy little secret. In a town without banks, things like coins, credit, and who owed whom for a wagon axle became services tucked neatly into the bosom of a madam's accounting book. Brothels often kept better records than the sheriff, more collateral than the general store, and more loyal clients than the church, which, if we're being honest, had some rather overlapping membership. Why? Because the madams, those queens of the velvet curtain, were arguably the most economically savvy folks around. Take a plush seat on the fainting couch of your imagination, and let's let the facts lounge around a little. First, understand that many miners and cowboys were paid in cash, or, more accurately, in what they thought was cash. Dust-caked coins, poker chips from transient saloons, or scrip issued by mining companies. And quite often, men stumbled into town with a month's pay and the urgent desire to exchange it for something warmer than a blanket. Enter the brothel, not only offering glittery companionship, but also a place to hold that money safely. It worked like this. Miners would give the madam a chunk of their pay to cover future visits, drinks, sometimes medicine, or just to keep from gambling it away by Tuesday. A madam might hold what amounted to entire payrolls locked in a backroom drawer, inside a cigar box that once held dreams of Havana, and now held the wages of 6 soot-covered bachelors named Hank. Some brothels issued tokens, charming little brass coins that could be used for drinks, dances, or 10 minutes of questionable poetry upstairs. These were redeemable only within the brothel, which, like a charming velvet-padded casino, ensured that money stayed snugly right where it started. This microeconomy, complete with its own form of currency, was often more stable than the shaken economy outside its rose-colored curtains. And then there were loans. Yes, loans. If a young buck fancied a new pair of boots, or maybe needed to replace the horse he bet last week, he might find himself negotiating over a parlor settee with a madam known only as Miss Ruby. If she thought he was good for it, she'd front him the cash. With interest, naturally. Not extortionate, just mildly character-building. Miss Ruby might not have worn a banker's bowler hat, but she could read a man's credit score in the tilt of his moustache. It wasn't just money, either. Brothels traded in information, much less tangible than silver coins, but substantially more potent. Over bourbon and coy smiles, men talked. They talked about cattle drives, silver shipments, whose claim was bogus, and whose marriage was teetering on a picket fence. The madams, always listening, learned everything. With this knowledge, some of them invested. Quietly, efficiently. Land deals were brokered in silk dressing gowns. Lodges were purchased. Even stagecoach routes were influenced by this whisper economy. A clever madam holding just the right debts and just the right secrets could make more decisions behind her lace curtain than the mayor could in City Hall. Some may wrinkle their nose at such influence, but it's worth noting that these women provided a curious form of stability in towns known more for buckshot than budgeting. They paid taxes, often more than anyone else. They funded fire brigades, bought stoves for schoolhouses, and at times even paid the salaries of local lawmen. That's right, the town marshal's paycheck may have been indirectly approved by someone named Peaches who knew where the real ledgers were kept. It's not so surprising, then, that many brothels were among the few buildings built in brick, solid, enduring and far less flammable than the moral panic that occasionally tried to shut them down. And when those fires swept through town, literal or figurative, it was often the brothel that rebuilt first, because they had the money, they had the workers, and they had, shall we say, motivation. So next time you imagine a classic Old West town, horses clomping, saloon doors swinging, dust glimmering in the late sun, remember the unseen banking empire just above the piano parlor, and remember that Madame Claire, in her crimson bodice and surprisingly sharp spectacles, likely understood compound interest better than half the men shouting about gold. The town may have thought it ran on grit, bullets and boot polish, but under the surface, it hummed to the rustle of bills and the scratch of ledgers kissed with perfume. And somewhere between the ledgers and the lace, a new kind of power was quietly growing, waiting for the next boom or the next bust. Folks often say that money makes the world go round, but in the Old West, if you wanted your world to keep turning with any grace or dignity, you'd have to stop by the brothel. Now, I know what you're thinking, but hear me out. These weren't just scandalous social stops under rose-colored lampshades. No. In many frontier towns, brothels quietly ran the local economy with the calm efficiency of a headmistress watching over an unruly boarding school. Pamphlets of accounting disguised by perfume and pillow talk, intrigue whispered between corset strings and ledgers. Now imagine, if you will, the clinking of spurred boots outside a two-story red structure, its windows glowing faintly golden through thick velvet curtains. Inside, finances and flirtations shuffled together like a saloon card game. House always wins. Much of this credit goes squarely to the madam, a role less about scandalous affairs and more about being the CEO of a high-value enterprise with a strict code of conduct and one eye forever on the sheriff's re-election campaign. You see, when trouble brews in a dusty town of miners, gamblers, and railroad men, there isn't a whole lot the preacher can do besides pray. But the madam, she has tabs on everyone, who owes money, who's got a temper, who should never touch the gin again. And she made sure her girls were safe, relatively speaking. In fact, some brothels ran tighter security than a bank, which makes sense. They often held more cash than one. Men left money for safekeeping. There, of all places. Imagine that. Trusting your hard-earned silver to a parlor with lace-trimmed lampshades and a piano that plays ragtime whenever someone enters a room slightly too dramatically. But back to the finances, because they're one of the quiet stars of this whole production. You see, brothels paid taxes, not just paid them, they often paid more than anyone else. When towns ran short on funds for a new firehouse or road maintenance, guess who got a special visit? That's right, the brothel, where fiscal responsibility wore perfume and kept records with astonishing precision. Some businesses struggled to keep their receipts crumpled in a cigar box. Madams had leather-bound ledgers, organized, categorized, and probably color-coded if someone invented the highlighter early enough. This steady cash flow wasn't simply tolerated, it was nurtured, albeit in secret. Town leaders might look down their noses in daylight sermons but showed up in private, at the back door at our night, hat in hand and budget in crisis. There were trails to be mended, constables to be paid, and no one knew better than the madam how to grease the wheels of civic progress without causing a stir. In more than a few towns, the path to progress was discreetly perfumed. And as if that wasn't enough, we have to talk about credit. Not moral credit, no one was handing out virtue points, but honest-to-goodness loaning. Brothels doubled as informal banks. Starting a livery stable? Need upgrade cash for your general store? See if Miss Josephine at the Dove's Nest might extend you a loan. Fascinatingly enough, she likely understood compound interest better than most of the local council. Oh, and she might require nothing but your word and your eyes to tell if you were good for it. That's another Old West magic trick. Character assessment performed at close conversational range with ambient piano music. Wall Street never had that kind of ambience, though perhaps it should. 1. Former saloon turned brothel in Montana reportedly helped fund the construction of the town's first schoolhouse. You can imagine how that went over at PTA meetings. Still, there it stood, painted bright white, with alphabet boards and earnest chalk dust, because Madame Eleanor believed in arithmetic, etiquette, and giving the next generation a slightly better chance than a whiskey-fueled card game. And perhaps that's the secret to why brothels ran the town. They knew everything, funded everything, and somehow managed to keep lawmen cooperative, with nothing more than ledger balance, honeyed words, and a tiny clinking bell at the top of the stairs. We'll drift quietly now into the next hazy room of this saloon-turned history book, where politics, paradoxes, and powder puffs awaited their moment in the lamplit hush. By the hush of lamplight and the rustle of bodices, brothel life in the Old West contained layers of leadership more intricate than a cattleman's poker bluff. And nowhere was this more evident, nor more quietly consequential, than in the mysterious role of the madam's ledger. Yes, dear listener, not her corset, not her fan, but the very book stuffed with tabbed pages and tiny sums. Now picture a brothel, gaslight flickering, velvet curtains drawn just so, laughter barely muffled behind wallpaper, and somewhere in a back room, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose, tallying figures in silence. She was the madam, of course, and her ledger wasn't just for keeping track of which gentleman drank too much or who'd gone missing in the bath again. She was often recording the town's unofficial economy. The madam had a hand in everything. She was the bookkeeper of egos, dreams, debts, and dairy purchases. Gunslinger lost at cards. Tab it. Bank manager needs discretion. Add a bonus. Mayor stops in for morale checks thrice weekly. There's a column for that. The ledger read like a sociological novella. Who owed? Who visited? Who scheduled bath time with suspicious enthusiasm? If you wanted to know which cattle baron returned from Dodge City broke and emotional, you merely had to squint at Rhodey, column 12. And these madams didn't just possess economic power. Many held social sway with subtlety so smooth it could butter a biscuit. You see, because brothels weren't exactly regulated, meaning they weren't quite legal, but also too lucrative to ignore, they existed on a tender strand of compromise. This put each madam in the curious position of being both illicit and indispensable. When election seasons arrived, politicians frequently found themselves sipping oversweetened tea in brothel parlors, carefully listening to the madam's thoughts on civic improvement, or at least pretending to while nervously clutching their campaign hats. Construction of a new water tower. Well, who exactly owned the parcel of land just behind Miss Ruby's place? And who'd quietly funded it after hours over brandy and whispered pressure? Sometimes the ledger even disguised loans so delicately it was essentially Western finance in petticoats. Bank denied your credit. The madam might lend you cash, quietly, and just ask you to write her name on your supply order down at the general store. Buy 2 sacks of sugar for Ruby, she might say with a wink. And just like that, she was dabbling in fiscal influence with a touch of sass. Of course, some madams developed such precise systems of accounting that one could argue they pioneered early models of microfinance. $1 borrowed on Tuesday, repaid in half hours by Thursday. Penalties for conduct unbecoming of a paying client, usually deducted in eggs, coal, or fine whiskey. Perhaps even an occasional chicken. Economists today might call that bartering with outstanding terms. But control went beyond money. Quiet, double-entry bookkeeping allowed these women to build coalitions, navigate rivalries, and keep entire towns from unraveling into arguments or worse, unattended civic planning meetings. After all, if a railroad tycoon and the sheriff were both paying customers and both preferred room 3, the madam became something of a diplomatic envoy, smoothing egos and rearranging appointments like a powdered peacekeeper. There was even a peculiar kind of judicial clout. True tales exist of disputes being softly mediated in brothel parlors, with madams presiding over arguments somewhere between clergy and arbitration committee. If 2 minors bickered over a mule or a claim and both owed debts to the same brothel, well, the consensus was reached not with a gavel, but the rustle of a silk gown and a knowing glance. In many dusty frontier towns, the brothel record books were the only paper trail of townspeople's actual lives. Who loved whom, who left, who forgot to pay their laundry girl. Sometimes they were the most accurate documentation that a person had ever lived there at all. Church registers were dusty. Town halls were prone to fires and forgetfulness. But Miss Clara's ledgers from 1879, those were bulletproof and color-coded. So the next time you think about power in the Old West, remember, it wasn't always the mayor who held the town together. Sometimes it was a woman with impeccable handwriting, an eye for detail, and a deep fondness for arithmetic after midnight. And with the books balanced and the whispers quieting, let us tiptoe gently onward to the next corner of brothel power, where entertainment met espionage and music played double agent beneath the parlor lamps. Picture a sweltering summer evening in a frontier town, the kind that smells of dry earth, horse sweat, and questionable moral decisions. The sun droops lazily behind the crooked buildings, casting its amber goodbye across swinging saloon doors and squeaking signposts. Candlelight flickers to life in the windows of the most mysteriously influential establishments in town. The brothels, not the banks, not the sheriff's office, just the brothels, glowing like lighthouses of whispered commerce and well-practiced diplomacy. Now let's wander, politely of course, into the parlor of one such establishment. The wallpaper is faded but ambitious, the furniture soft with the wear of scandal and secrets. Somewhere upstairs, someone is playing a piano with a devotion that probably outpaces their hygiene standards. And seated in a red velvet armchair, balancing a cup of something pungent and probably not tea, is the brothel madam, the quiet force field of this unruly town. These women were more than mere keepers of lace curtains and late-night rendezvous. They were business magnates wrapped in corsets. If society had let them wear suits, the entire economy might have collapsed out of sheer intimidation. One such madam, known only as Miss Evangeline, a name that sounded like it belonged to a traveling opera singer or that one aunt who always smells of pies and danger, owned both the brothel and the lot across from the courthouse. When the town telegraph croaked its last dying click, it was Miss Evangeline who loaned the mayor the funds to replace it. Her only condition, a small, unassuming clause that allowed her to choose the location of the post office. Surprise, it was right next door to her establishment, leading to a robust increase in what she called foot traffic. You see, real estate in the Old West wasn't just about land. It was about influence, and the madams had it in top-shelf supply. They built, bought, and quietly dominated entire blocks. The saloons might have gotten the headlines, but the brothels held the deeds. And then there were taxes. Municipal budgets in these boomtowns had the stability of a gambler's wallet and about as much planning. Who funded the schoolhouse roof when the storms peeled it off like a sardine lid? Probably a madam. Who built the first fire brigade barn, complete with an actual bell and one barely trained horse? Likely funded by entertainment tax, a cheery euphemism for the substantial fees brothels paid just to exist. These taxes weren't just tolerated, they were counted on. Without them, the town wouldn't have two horses to hitch together. Of course, this came with an awkward social dance. Respectable townsfolk would clutch their pearls and sigh melodramatically about the moral decay arriving on every dusty stagecoach. And yet, when the church needed a shiny new bell, or the bakery door needed a new hinge, where did they sniff around for donations? That's right, knock knock. It's Miss Evangeline with a bag of coins and a subtle smirk. Because while polite society wrung its hands, the brothels understood something very unpolite, but deeply practical. Control doesn't come from the loudest voice. It comes from the quietest coin purse that somehow always opens at just the right time. And this wasn't unique to one town. In Deadwood, Tombstone, Dodge City, if there was a population of hot-blooded opportunity chasers with questionable pasts and nowhere else to go, there was a brothel propping up the local economy like the world's most controversial foundation. Their influence crept into more than cash registers and real estate deeds. Madams often employed doctors for their workers' health, insisted on cleanliness, and on occasion, provided more accurate census counts than the government could manage. After all, the madam knew exactly how many people were in town and where they slept on Tuesday nights. Now, as the night deepens and the stars gather like gossiping old friends, imagine the silhouettes of those red-curtained windows glowing against the dark, humming not just with laughter but with ledgers. Inside, women in feathered hats sip from teacups laced with bourbon, talking politics more fluently than half the town council. Business deals are brokered under chandeliers of dusty crystals. Men come and go, but the madams stay. Steady, shrewd, and terrifyingly well-dressed. In the world of lawless towns and rough justice, the brothel was the checklist nobody admitted following, and the madam was the quiet mayor in silk gloves. Now, let's stroll just a bit farther down the dusty boardwalk. Past the brothel, past the saloon echoing with off-key singing of "Oh My Darling Clementine," and pause at a peculiar little shop, glowing faintly with the scent of old books and even older secrets. Because believe it or not, behind more than one set of painted lips lived a surprisingly fervent appetite for books and education. But that, dear dreamer, is another story altogether. In the dusty stillness of the frontier night, when even the saloons softened their piano tunes to a tired tinkle and cattle snored like creaky barn doors, the real power in town wasn't wearing a badge, a collar, or even pants. It was wearing a corset. Not always tightly laced, mind you, but symbolically snug. In the boardwalk towns of the American West, where morality took long coffee breaks, madams weren't just madams. They were the de facto CEOs, HR departments, zoning boards, and occasionally the Municipal Entertainment Committee. You see, while the mayor of a town might have had an office, Miss Ruby had a chaise lounge. And let's be honest, more people visited her parlor than City Hall. Brothels in the 19th century frontier were, at their core, very well-run businesses. That might not sound terribly titillating on the surface, but it's all in the details. Miss Ruby, or Miss Pearl, or whatever gemstone a madam used to brand herself, had to know economics, supply chains, risk management, strategic placement, and customer service. She was equal parts financier and bouncer, and unlike most men in town, she couldn't afford to get drunk at noon. One might think these houses of ill repute, as 19th century newspapers so primly called them, often while secretly receiving money from the same establishments, were lawless dens of vice. And yes, there was vice. But there was also careful bookkeeping, scheduled health checkups, good lighting, and towels. Scandalous, yes, but sanitary. Madams maintained meticulous expense logs, noting candles, cleaning supplies, piano tuning and refreshments, often lemon cordial or watered-down whiskey. Frilly curtains weren't just for mood, they were part of the business. Everything was calculated to strike that perfect balance between fantasy and leverage. People talked more freely when they felt at ease, a strategic bonus, since madams often knew more about a town's affairs than the telegraph operator and undertaker combined. There was also the small matter of credit. When the general store wouldn't extend $1 to a broke ranch hand, Miss Ruby might. Not for free, of course. She knew the value of a precisely timed favor, a loaf of bread now, and maybe a mysterious bit of gossip in return, or a tip about when the cattle drive was really coming in. That kind of information made you indispensable. And then there were the charities. It may shock you, but brothels often funded the town's orphanages, libraries, and fire brigades. When the sheriff couldn't afford new boots for his men, or, more accurately, for his one man and his mangy dog, it was the madam who footed the bill, usually anonymously. The town preacher might have thundered about sin from the pulpit, but he rarely refused the pews Ruby had donated the year prior. Even more ironic, or poetic, depending on your tolerance for double standards, is that many brothels adhered to moral codes. Really? No swearing on the porch after 11, no physical altercations in the parlor. Some even banned married men, though most did so with the same seriousness as a wet paint sign outside a saloon. Still, it was structure amid chaos. And whisper this, madams paid taxes. In fact, they were often some of the highest taxpayers in town. That dusty, two-room schoolhouse didn't fund itself, and chances were it got more funding from the parlor down the block than from Washington, D.C. Honestly, if you wanted something done in a frontier town, you talked to the madam before the mayor. He might have had a desk, but hers had doilies. Women like Mattie Silks, Dora Dufran, and Molly Johnson didn't just run brothels. They ran empires, with privacy screens and polite euphemisms, and they did it with resilience, business savvy, and a sometimes suspicious number of canaries. It was fashionable in certain districts to keep a birdcage near the front window. The symbolism was, one might say, a bit on the beak, so while the sun dipped behind the buttes and left the towns in strips of peachy twilight, these women counted ledgers instead of sheep. Their empires quietly chimed beneath velvet curtains and stained glass lamps, while the rest of the frontier world dreamed and drooled through its spurred boots, now nestled into your pillow. As the prairie winds shuffle softly through your imagination, we drift onward to a quieter corner, into the mysterious etiquette of visiting the lady upstairs, which, as it turns out, was a masterclass in manners, boots off at the door included. Somewhere beneath the flicker of kerosene lanterns and the size of a piano missing more keys than it had left, there was an economy of favors humming along in the corners of old west towns. Not the gold strikes or cattle drives, but something rather more insinuating. It was a dance less choreographed than barroom brawls and more delicate than a poker bluff, the subtle art of the social ledger. You see, in the hallowed halls of those brothels, velvet curtains, perfume thick as molasses, and velvet chaise lounges that were mostly just reupholstered crates. The true books of the town were being balanced. And no, I don't mean tax records. Let's not insult ghosts with such fantasies. In many towns, the madam was something between a mayor and a magician. She never ran for office. Why bother? She already knew where the sheriff kept his secrets and how the preacher liked his whiskey. Instead, she leaned gently on the scales of local fortunes by keeping mental tabs better than any accountant east of the Pecos. You see, coupling wasn't the only service for sale. If you needed a loan, the brothel could float you a few coins without asking questions about prospects or sobriety. If your cousin from Missouri was missing, the girls heard gossip first. And if your political campaign needed quiet funding, well, wouldn't you know, Rose had a taste for civic improvement between card games. But power glittered most clearly in the ledgers not printed, in the vast, whispered economy of favors. Maybe the blacksmith needed horseshoes, but his customer was drunk and unpaid. So the madam sent 2 of her girls with smiles and cigars to sweet-talk the old man. Shoes were delivered. Somehow he never even noticed the IOU stuffed in his boots. The brothels weren't just keeping up with the community, they were the community's connective tissue, albeit in silk stockings. Everyone owed them something. Respect, money, secrets, or the memory of a particularly charitable Thursday. And in a time when the bank might collapse before breakfast and your horse might get stolen by lunch, trust was heavier than gold. "Oh, but weren't brothels looked down upon?" asks the history textbook, clutching its moral compass too tightly. To which the dusty silence of 1880 softly chuckles. Publicly, sure. But try closing one and watch the bank tellers, blacksmiths and bartenders start sweating. There was an almost ecclesiastic pattern to the process. A man sinned, drank, repented, maybe gambled, sinned again, hoped to marry, then thanked the madam for introducing him to an eligible widow. A different sort of matchmaking, but no less effective. And if you think all of this rested on the shoulders of shifty cowboys and shot-up gamblers, it did not. Let us talk, gently, about influence. During the temperance movement, some madams would quietly fund opposition papers, ensuring the local vote leaned just far enough from prohibition to keep the whiskey flowing. Not for greed, heavens no, but for the sake of civic cheer. Dry counties had famously dry brothels. No one wanted that, least of all the piano. The madams cultivated more than girls and whiskey. They cultivated loyalty. They gave turkeys on Christmas to families whose husbands drank their wages. They paid for school books when the teacher's budget mysteriously vanished into someone's poker debt. They, quite bizarrely, kept order without once wearing a star badge or tipping a Stetson. Local judges, clergymen, and bankers, none of whom were ever seen entering the brothel, trust the back door, still found reasons to thank the establishment around the holidays. Perhaps the brothel held a particularly successful fundraiser for the town water pump. Or perhaps that letter from Denver asking questions about land titles was never quite answered, thanks to a little intervention. There's a quiet, persuasive power in being the person everyone confides in. Brothels, by the unique nature of their profession, specialized in knowing more than they said. They could ruin you. They didn't. In return, favors flowed. A mine permit approved here. A suspicious fire forgotten there. Legal proceedings gently unpursued. So while saloons spat out fights and general stores eked by on credit, the brothel, with its velvet conspiracy of kindnesses, stitched the town together. Not with thread, but with the understanding that everyone needed something. And the brothel, sympathetic confidant to all, was happy to oblige. Somewhere outside in the desert dark, a coyote howled lazily across the horizon. Inside the brothel, someone stirred whiskey with a silver spoon that had definitely been misplaced from the mayor's house. But no one said a thing. Favors, after all, are best not inventoried. And eventually, the real power doesn't wear a badge. It lounges on velvet, listens well, and never forgets a single debt or a birthday. In the hush of night just before dawn, the brothel's windows flickered low, and the town around it slept, oblivious, but blissfully balanced. Next, we drift quietly into the parlor rooms of influence, where the guest lists said more than the minutes of any town meeting ever could. By the gentle glow of kerosene lamps, where shadows danced on worn wooden floorboards and the piano played slightly out of tune, the brothel parlor became something of a social stock exchange. Men lounged on red velvet settees as women in lace-trimmed corsets debated mining rights and livestock futures. That's right. When Miss Lila Bell leaned forward with a glass of sweetened gin and asked a cattle baron if he thought the winter would be hard, she wasn't idly making conversation. She was probing the market. It may come as a slow-dawning surprise, but data analytics in the mining towns of the Old West didn't originate in dusty saloons or at railroad depots. Oh no. The most reliable intelligence came from the women who heard it first, between toasts and tousled sheets, between whispered regrets and whiskey-fueled boasts. The brothel, my weary traveller, was where information flowed free and unfiltered. With the right eyebrow raise and a flick of a fan, secrets and economic forecasts passed like folded banknotes under a gaming table. Now, consider Miss Ruby Thatcher, whose feather and fern establishment sat squarely between the town's only post office and its second most unreliable dentist. Ruby had a memory like a steel trap dipped in perfume and velvet. She could recall which rich gentleman ordered which girl, what he drank, and more importantly, what anxieties he mumbled post-hanky-panky about his boss, his investments, or the shady goings-on at the rail yard. Ruby kept a little notebook, allegedly for inventory purposes, but no one believed that crock. That notebook contained enough economic patterns to rival the modern Federal Reserve. And then there was Alma Corrigan of Cisco Gulch, whose girls didn't just entertain. They took dictation, literally. The local bank manager, too nervous to be seen speaking openly about the precarious state of his loans, found it safer to chat in the comfort of Alma's parlor, while a blonde named Darcy dutifully transcribed his concerns in flawless shorthand. By the time word of a pending foreclosure reached the sheriff, it had already been known in the brothel for 3 days, verified twice, and dryly joked about over breakfast. So stunning was the brothel's role in absorbing and redistributing local knowledge that in some towns, business owners began scheduling more productive appointments. A sawmill investor might emerge from an hour in Madame Eloise's mint-scented parlor, not just slightly rumpled, but also $200 poorer and, paradoxically, better briefed. A new silver vein 2 towns over, the mayor's son in debt to a gambling syndicate. Eloise knew. And she would share, for a fee, of course, or perhaps in exchange for political influence come election season. It wasn't just about high finance, though. Brothel women often discovered which shopkeepers were cheating customers with light scales, or which outlaws had been quietly sponsored by ranchers trying to strong-arm land sales. In towns where the sheriff lived in fear of outgunned desperados, and the priest couldn't risk offending the largest donors, it was the brothel that operated as the real watchtower. Not officially, of course, but unofficially. Oh well. Let's just say if Miss Lila closed her doors early for the evening, the mayor paid her a visit faster than you could say closed economy. And in all of this, what is perhaps most astonishing isn't the influence the brothels had, it's how adeptly they disguised it. No big declarations or banners proclaiming, "We know everything, come parley over cognac." Just knowing glances, perfume-scented letters, and a system built on trust, repetition, and, well, blackmail, if necessary. And so, night after night, as poker chips clattered in the saloons and horses clomped down muddy lanes, the warm glow of the brothel windows beckoned, not just with the promise of pleasure, but with something far more powerful: perspective. A miner might stumble in thinking he was looking for comfort, only to leave with the news that a silver strike in Arizona was already proving worthless, according to a gentleman from Utah he'd never met before, but whose business cards were mysteriously distributed with the house matches. Odd, isn't it? How the most whispered conversations end up being the ones that steer the strongest winds. And as those winds shifted, so too did the town. But of course, no one dared admit who really held the sails. At least, not out loud. Now picture the velvet curtains closing again for the night, cards reshuffled, footsteps echoing down the corridor. In the distance, the faint whistle of the midnight train, bringing more visitors, more secrets, and just maybe a little bit of trouble. As the sun dipped below the clapboard horizon of our imaginary frontier town, let's call it Whisper Gulch. Just because everything sounds softer with a poetic name, there was a quiet clinking behind curtains. You might think this was the sound of cowboys nervously counting coins before heading into the saloon, but no, dear listener. This was the rhythmic rustle of ledgers, champagne flutes, and the measured arithmetic of madams. What most folks didn't realize was that while the town's mayor smiled solemnly from a rocking chair on Main Street, and the sheriff sipped his second-best whiskey, the real financial planner of Whisper, Gulch wore a corset and had a parlor with velvet drapes. You see, the brothels, those often whispered about silk-threaded sanctuaries of the American West, were not just bawdy amusements. They were banks. In heels. One of the most underestimated figures in the brothel economy was the madam. These were women with the social skills of a diplomat, the business acumen of a railroad tycoon, and the patience of someone continually listening to clientele describe their self-published poetry. Take, for example, Miss Lila May Featherstone, a fictional name but drawn from very real types. Lila May kept a fine house on the edge of town, gingerbread trim on the eaves, and a line of carriages stretched beside it like well-fed cats. Lila May didn't just run the place, she ran the place. She offered loans to local shopkeepers who couldn't make rent. She paid the doctor's bill when the apothecary's boy caught a tragic case of mule-kickitis. When the town council failed to finance a new school bell, who do you think gingerly wrote a check from her velvet-tasseled pocketbook? That's right, Lila May and her sisters, economic experts of the day, who mostly wore bowler hats and used the word robustly a lot, were baffled by how these frontier women always had liquid cash on hand. The town treasury might run dry buying 3 new fence posts, but brothels overflowed with gold dust and monogrammed coins. This wasn't magic. It was because every pocket of commerce eventually clinked its way into those red-lit halls. Miners spent their handfuls of ore after a long dig. Ranchers bought rounds of drinks for dancers with names like Ruby and Faith, but whose real names were probably Margaret and Mildred. Salesmen arrived with samples of soap and mustache wax and left without their shirts, sometimes figuratively, sometimes literally. And because the brothel kept meticulous books, yes, real ledgers with gold ink and embroidered bookmarks, they could track, invest, and redistribute funds with more reliability than the state bank. It was also well known that whenever a new building went up, a church, a general store, or even a jail, it suspiciously coincided with the sudden delivery of lavish donations from anonymous sources. Anonymity was, of course, a formality. Everyone knew. But in towns like Whisper Gulch, there existed an elegant, unspoken truth. The brothel supported the fabric of daily life. Like a good corset, it was both hidden and absolutely essential. Even law enforcement, the badge-wielding types who were technically supposed to find these operations, were often seen tipping their hats and receiving scones on quiet Sunday mornings. That's because Madame Lila May hosted the best teas in town, where gossip was exchanged like currency, and peace was bartered 1 cup at a time. Now, these madams didn't just manage their own prosperity. Many helped their girls learn to read and write, use bank accounts, even escape the business when they wanted. In an age when many women couldn't sign a mortgage contract without a man's permission, a lady running a brothel in the West was, curiously enough, a rare example of female independence and management. Of course, not all brothels were the same. Some were rough, others refined. Some madams were kind, some were less so. But in the case of our dear Lila May and her velvet empire, she had helped more townsfolk than the preacher and alderman combined, and with significantly fewer sermons. In the golden hush of twilight, with dusky lamplight filtering through lace curtains and the distant tune of a piano lilting down the avenue, these houses of assignation quietly cradled the town's pulse. They were accountants, employers, informal city planners, and on slow nights, therapists paid in silk tokens and kind smiles. And tomorrow, when that same sun rises over Whisper Gulch and the blacksmith swings his hammer, he'll do so thanks, in part, to the stable. Economy. Mrs. Featherstone and her girls built over late-night parlor chats and ledger balancing by candlelight. But as the lamplight dims and the petticoats settle, there's another layer to unpack, a quieter, more personal side to the women behind those velvet doors. If you strolled past a brothel in the Old West, not that you, dear sleepy listener, would partake in such scandalous sightseeing, the establishment might have looked unremarkable. A little sign swung gently in the high plains wind. A lamp flickered in the upstairs window. But step inside and, past the velvet curtains and clinking whiskey glasses, you'd find something remarkable humming beneath the surface. Accounting ledgers. Yes, the real hum of power in many frontier brothels sounded less like giggles and piano music and more like the scratch of ink on parchment. You see, in many dusty western towns, the madams were not just the keepers of comfort and lace. They were also the most financially literate people in a 100-mile radius. Town banks, when they existed, were often run by nervous men in bowler hats who worried more about stagecoach robberies than compound interest. Meanwhile, madams like Mattie Silks in Denver or Fanny Porter down in San Antonio were collecting payments on courtesy credit, investing in property, and sometimes, if you'll pardon the phrase, bailing out the bank. Indeed, it wasn't uncommon for a madam to lend money to the sheriff, the mayor, or even that very bank manager when times were tough. Brothels, despite their supposedly scandalous reputation, often had the steadiest cash flow in town. People didn't always need law or religion, but in the rough and tumble middle of nowhere, they did need a roof, a warm meal, and perhaps a sympathetic ear. Or two, or several. Now, while some businesses kept a rifle behind the counter for protection, a clever madam used more subtle weapons: influence, wit, and the occasional well-placed donation. School books short this month. The brothel might quietly pay for them. Church roof leaking again? A mysterious donor appears with the funds. The pews never ask questions. And all of this helped keep the establishment, technically illegal in many places, conveniently tolerated. Nods from the marshal, polite avoidance from the preacher, and a wink from the mayor. That was the social contract, unspoken but deeply felt, like a secret handshake made with curtsies and brandy. Then there was bookkeeping. Oh, the glorious boredom of it. Most folks assume brothels were run loosely, all wild banjo playing and spur-jangling chaos. In reality, they had strict rules, rosters, and daily schedules more reliable than the town's telegraph operator. One woman might handle inventory, whiskey, linens, spare corset laces. Another tracked appointments. Appointments, of course, being the euphemism of the day, rivaled only by entertainments and the ever-versatile visitations. There were expense reports, supply orders, payroll. Yes, payroll. Some brothels paid wages, others worked on a percentage model. Either way, madams kept detailed records, often tucked inside Bibles or disguised as cookbooks, to throw off nosy guests who thought they'd stumbled into a recipe for mulled cider, but instead found a ledger of John Doe's weekly habits. Some even paid taxes, believe it or not. It was easier to explain revenue as coming from boarding house services, a term as elastic as a new garter strap. And who, in these little financial empires, got the final say? The madam, of course. With a glance, she could approve a loan for a local merchant, or deny a sheriff his usual discount if he'd been too aggressive in enforcing ordinances last Saturday, like a matriarchal Swiss banker dipped in perfume and sass. Even their names inspired whispers. Belle Brezing, for example, not only ran the most prominent brothel in Lexington, Kentucky, but did so with such decorum that she was praised in editorials after her death and rumored to be the inspiration for Belle Watling in Gone with the Wind. The only thing more powerful than gossip in the West was good PR, and madams knew how to curate mystery better than a magician with a moustache. So while the town's official ledgers spoke of mining yields and livestock auctions, the quiet arithmetic of real power was being scribbled behind red velvet curtains. In lace-trimmed offices, over tea and ledgers, the business of desire and finance blended until they were indistinguishable. Soft-spoken tycoons in petticoats, disguising empire as hospitality. And as the lanterns outside flickered low, and the janitor locked up the saloon next door, another day's profits were tallied beneath a light blush of rosewater and candle soot. But beyond the ledgers and numbers, there was something even more powerful brothels possessed. Something less tangible but far more intoxicating. Influence, yes, but also Information. Secrets whispered over cigars and sighs, the kind of currency more valuable than gold dust. And that, dear listener, is where our next dreamy drift shall take us. It wasn't just silk corsets and whiskey breath drifting down the wooden sidewalks of Dodge City. No, something more complex breezed between batwing saloon doors and polished piano keys. Contracts. Yes, proper, legal contracts, albeit often scribbled in pencil on the backs of liquor invoices. These agreements formed invisible threads, deftly pulled by the madams who, while wearing ostrich-feathered hats, were somehow the closest thing some towns had to an economic development office. In truth, many brothels operated like robust small businesses with oddly efficient HR departments. And while they may not have offered dental insurance or a 401k, they did offer room, board, and something resembling career mobility, at least by frontier standards. The women were independent contractors in a way. Contracts might stipulate how much they'd be paid per client, percentages owed to the house, and even rules about personal time, which, like a unicorn sighting, was more mythical than real. Now, wielding these contracts and expectations with the deft hand of a railroad tycoon in a corseted gown was the brothel's madam, part landlord, part accountant, part therapist, and full-time social strategist. Her parlor doubled as a negotiation chamber, her stairs acted as a velvet-roped gate to the heart of town economics, and her ledger book. Probably more accurate than the sheriff's arrest records. Not hard to do, really, since many of those arrests were made while the sheriff was severely distracted by said parlor. You see, towns didn't run on mayors or marshals. They endured on the whims of who held the credit tabs. And the brothel, with its nightly influx of coins and secrets, became a central bank of sorts. Need a loan, the saloon keeper might offer you half a drink on credit, but the madam could float you payroll and still remind you to eat. She remembered birthdays, grudges, blood types, all while keeping your IOUs nestled between perfume sachets in an embroidered satin box. What's more, she had all the receipts, not just the literal ones, documenting cash flow, meals supplied, and the occasional property acquisition. Oh yes, they purchased land, but also those far more valuable, the metaphorical receipts. She knew who was really doing what behind whose barn, which judge drank laudanum laced with milk, and which preacher had an unusually thorough understanding of French poetry recited at 2 a.m. Nowhere, perhaps, was this quiet power more evident than during local elections. The brothel wasn't just an entertainment venue, it functioned as a polling place of political influence. With the wave of her satin-gloved hand, a madam could assure that a candidate was highly favored, or on the flip side, quietly disqualified by rumor. Whispered hint, dropped like a lace handkerchief, could sink a campaign as neatly as a bullet, and with far less mess on the wallpaper. And here's a particularly cozy economic revelation. Brothels often paid more taxes than the surrounding 20 buildings combined. While most businesses shaded their profits with the subtlety of a closing time blackout, brothels paid their dues openly. Some madams even contributed to civic projects, a new roof for the schoolhouse, repairs for the orphanage, a proper spittoon at the bank, all funded in part by the sipping of gin and the subtle sanctioning of behaviors that might make a Sunday school teacher drop her hymnal. These charitable contributions weren't out of pure altruism, of course. Like all smart investors, they knew that a thriving town brought more men, more money, and more opportunity for the house to remain central in every social transaction. Build a piano for the church choir, and you might see a deputy loosen up enough to start tipping better. Fund the sewing circle, and the community might start to see you less as a scandal and more as a financial pillar draped in taffeta and surrounded by velvet curtains. It's an odd truth that some of the most powerful figures of the Old West built their empires not with six-shooters or gold mines, but with patience, ledgers, and an unfailing memory for exactly who owed what, in cash, kindness, or conduct. And as the candles flicker in the upstairs rooms and the ink dries on yet another evening's accounts, we might tiptoe down the hall to explore another quietly powerful figure, one who rarely took the stage but pulled countless strings from behind a velvet curtain. If you strolled through a frontier town in the 1880s with a curious glint in your eye and dust on your boots, you may have noticed something peculiar about where the lamplight lingered longest after sunset. Saloons buzzed, general stores clattered, and street lamps flickered like hesitant fireflies. But like clockwork, the real energy of the evening began to shimmer around the establishment with the most velvet curtains and the softest laughter, often nestled just uphill, with the best view in town. The brothel. Now let's be clear, these weren't the rickety shacks portrayed in dime novels with the Scarlet Lady peeking through lace at passers-by. No. The best brothels were fine-tuned machines, as elegant and efficient as a Swiss timepiece, just with fewer gears and more champagne. One such place, the Gem Theatre in Deadwood, was more than just a soiree of silk and stubble, owned by the infamous Al Swearingen, whose vocabulary contained more curse words than the Oxford English Dictionary had adjectives. The Gem was a social hub, a political soapbox, and occasionally a courtroom, depending on who you asked. Al had a mustache almost as big as his ambitions, and his lady associates, well, they knew the secrets behind every mayoral campaign and bar brawl in town. You see, the brothel wasn't just where people went, it was where people confessed. Not because they were seeking redemption, but because champagne plus melancholy equals truth. The madams knew who was cheating at poker, who was hiding stolen gold rush claims, and who secretly fancied the undertaker's daughter. Many of the women working in these houses became unofficial archivists of the truth, adorning silence like a saint would wear a halo, only with far more powder rouge. Take Madame Lou Graham of Seattle. She ran one of the most elite establishments in the Pacific Northwest. Lou bankrolled libraries, paid public school teachers during economic downturns, and was known to have better bookkeeping than the local treasury. It's said the city avoided bankruptcy because she quietly footed the bill. Now that's what I call philanthropy in fishnets. Brothels, for all their lace-line mystery, held a strange position in town politics, officially shunned by polite society, yet quietly essential to it. Local lawmen were often regular guests, sometimes to enforce rules, other times to forget them. Elections were won in parlors, not polling stations, and business deals toasted over lemonade, laced with something decidedly not lemony. And then there were the town's wives, who, despite what their corseted posture suggested, were not entirely ignorant of the brothel's social ripple effect. Many developed what we might now call a mutually beneficial avoidance agreement. You stay over there, I raise the kids over here, and everyone pretends the piano lessons from the brothel's parlor aren't quite so advanced. In fact, madams were often among the best educated women in the region. They read newspapers shipped in from the East, studied languages to entertain visiting diplomats, and knew their way around land claims better than most ranchers. If the local banker wanted advice on investing in a mining operation, he might ask his mistress, who, incidentally, kept her own ledger better than he did. Patronage often came not just from desire, but admiration. These women dressed like queens, negotiated like lawyers, and ran their businesses with an iron bustle and a velvet smile. In towns where the average lifespan of a business was shorter than the time it took to saddle a horse, brothels endured. Not just because of lust, but because of savvy economics and an uncanny ability to adapt to the unpredictable rhythms of the frontier. Even the architecture whispered their social standing. While most buildings used pine and prayer to stay upright, madams built with imported cherry wood, installed indoor plumbing, and, gasp, flushed toilets. In a world where most folks only bathed on Saturdays, and only if the mule didn't need the water first, this was pure magic. So yes, as the town quieted down and the lamplight yawed across the plank roads, the brothel hummed like a diesel dream stitched in taffeta. Wasn't just a place of business, it was a beating heart, a whispered counsel, an economic engine tucked under lace. And as we slip deeper into the velvet-lit backrooms of these unwritten histories, it's time to peek behind the beaded curtains and meet the women who built the empire. Without ever leaving the porch, somewhere between the scent of horse sweat and the distant clink of a poker chip, business was booming, Not in the general store, not in the bank, and not even in the saloon. No, the true cornerstone of commerce in many frontier towns lay behind the rose-colored curtains of the local brothel. And not just any brothel, we're talking about places with grand names like the Scarlet Lantern, the Gilded Time, or, perhaps most impossibly ironic, the House of Gentle Rest. It was in these parlors, adorned with plush velvet sofas and gaslights that never quite stopped hissing, that the true economy of many Wild West towns quietly turned on its axis, not just because of the services rendered, though those certainly contributed, but because madams, more often than not, were some of the savviest entrepreneurs west of the Mississippi. A clever madam didn't just run a house of ill repute, she ran a network. And she did it with the grace of a duchess and the tactical mind of a railroad baron. These women weren't just selling companionship, they were investing in real estate, lending money to newly arrived prospectors, and offering short-term credit to saloons until the next gold shipment came through. Some of the most influential madams kept ledgers with more precision than the town bank, which, let's be honest, wasn't the highest bar to clear. The First National Bank of Dry Gulch, for example, was operated by a man named Silas, who had gone bankrupt twice already and stored deposits under his mattress. Literally. In contrast, a madam like Dora Dufran of Deadwood, South Dakota, had books that would make a tax auditor weep with joy. Dora didn't just keep track of who owed her money. She kept track of who owed anyone money. She knew the financial heartbeat of her town better than the mayor, better than the blacksmith, possibly even better than the town telegraph operator, who had access to secrets but was known to drink like a fish and forget his own birthday. You see, a brothel offered much more than evening entertainment. It was where land deals were struck over brandy, where the ambitions of miners were whispered between silk sheets, and where the social hierarchy of a town got quietly upended. After all, it was hard to pretend you were above someone when both of you had seen each other without your boots or your secrets. And lest anyone assume this power was wielded discreetly, the good madams made sure it wasn't. Oh no. Subtlety is for people trying to stay unnoticed, and these women didn't want to blend in. They wanted to be seen bringing bread to widows and whiskey to funerals. They wanted it known that they paid for school books, funded church pews, and occasionally built a public bathhouse, which earned them begrudging nods from the Temperance League and full-blown adoration during flu season. The irony, of course, was that while society liked to pretend these establishments were shadowy corners of morality, they were often better lit, better managed, and frankly, more organized than anything else in town. Words like illegal and immoral danced on the tongues of visiting preachers and passing judges, but when winter came and the town needed coal, it was often the brothel that footed the bill. Even the law occasionally found these houses indispensable. You didn't cross a madam who knew who'd been betting on cockfights, whose cattle weren't entirely paid for, and which lawman had borrowed gold dust during a particularly unlucky poker game. These weren't just houses of pleasure. They were fortresses of leverage, spangled intelligence agencies in lace, and corsets. And yet, despite the power, there was a strange gentleness to it, like everything else on the frontier, a dusty blend of necessity and charm. Madams employed laundresses and cooks, musicians and tailors. They gave homes to displaced women, a path to survival, and for many, a rare sense of control in a world that offered few reins to hold. The frontier may have grown on grit and guns, but it thrived on the soft silence of silk shoes, walking down a polished staircase, and the rustle of business being conducted with a fluttering fan and a raised eyebrow. As the wind whistled through the dark eaves of another sleepless saloon, we turn now to one such woman, an unexpected tycoon hiding behind a false name, 3 boas, and a business acumen sharp enough to cut through the desert dusk, out beyond the dusty clapboard fronts and swinging saloon doors of the American West, behind the shimmering haze of heat mirages and the brittle echo of spurred boots on boardwalk planks. There was a secret economy brewing, and it had absolutely nothing to do with gold, or cattle, or the railroad tycoons who always seemed one cigar puff away from spontaneous combustion. No, tucked past the drunks and the drifters, Nestled between the general store and the blacksmith's forge sat the mysterious headquarters of this quiet empire, the accounting ledgers of the madams. Of all the ledgers in the West, none were so meticulous as those kept in the brothels. While banks were busy burning down for the third time that year, and ranchers tried to estimate the price of beef based on the wind's mood, the ladies of the lamplit parlors were practicing financial science with the precision of Swiss horologists. Columns of income, itemized expenses, credit granted, interest due, every whiskey poured and every hour rented was scrawled in perfect cursive. It turns out when you run the most profitable business in a 20-mile radius, you get quite good at math. But the real magic, soft and spiraled like the perfume curling through red velvet curtains, was not just in how much money they brought in. It was in what they did with it. Madams, often out of necessity, but just as often out of pride, became something of a one-woman central bank in their towns. Need a loan to start a bakery? Anna could help. Want to fund a new schoolhouse bell? Talk to Miss May upstairs between 3 and 5. Need lumber to replace that church roof that blew off again last week? Madame Josephine had a supplier in Colorado Territory who could deliver discreetly and promptly. They loaned without mortgages, lent without prejudice, and occasionally forgave debts entirely if the borrower also brought lemon cake and wasn't too self-righteous about it. And don't be misled. These weren't saintly figures descending with angel wings embroidered in velvet. These were savvy businesswomen who understood the grand theatrical performance of survival. If the brothel helped fix the porch of the jailer's house and treated the mayor's rheumatism with a dash of opium-laced tea, well, it was simply good community relations. In fact, many brothels kept open tabs for local lawmen, religious officials, and traveling salesmen who specialized in miracle tonic and inconvenient diseases. Sometimes they called it charity. Sometimes it was hush money. But usually it was just Tuesday. And through it all, towns began to quietly orbit them. Not around their neon hearts as later cities would, but more gently, like moths keeping their distance from candlelight. Their financial acumen created something very close to civic infrastructure, even if most folks would never admit it out loud. It helped that many madams also hired tutors to teach the working girls how to read. In a time when even outlaw gangs resisted the concept of punctuation, it wasn't uncommon for some of the most literate women west of the Missouri to be found editing love letters by lamplight in second-floor drawing rooms. Not that they got credit, of course. History, being somewhat allergic to nuance, preferred to remember businessmen who oversaw 5 bankrupt saloons and 3 burnt-out liveries as frontier entrepreneurs, while women like Madame Lou Graham, who quite literally bailed out the city of Seattle with her own money, had to settle for whispered rumors and the occasional coded newspaper wink. Still, they made do. Many even invested outside their own walls. Real estate, pawnbroking, stage line shares, and once, quite famously, a small but robust herd of dairy cows that ended up belonging fully to the Madam of the Diamond Bell after her paramour disappeared and left only a note that read, "Gone to Arizona. Watch out for the one with the mean eyes." But perhaps what made their quiet leadership so powerfully enduring was the gentleness behind it, the tangible understanding of what it meant to be invisible, underestimated, and still intrinsically needed. As velvet curtains swayed and oil lamps dimmed, their influence wrapped itself around the town like the scent of hot bathwater and lavender soap, subtle but unshakable. And so, among the clicking beads of abacuses and the faint whiff of bourbon in teakwood bowls, the Old West brothel became something more than its usual legends of scandal. It became a bank, a safety net, and in its very own way, a kind of sanctuary. Now, as a sliver of silver moonlight stretches across the dusty roofs and the town exhales into night, let's follow the scent of a secret, just around the corner, into the next dim-lit parlor, where whispers pass through wallpaper and no one dares underestimate the housekeeping staff. As dusk settled like a faded velvet curtain over the dusty roofs of the frontier town, The gentle clinking of glasses and spurs mingled with the low hum of piano music, drifting softly from the parlor window of Madame Eloise's establishment. While the brothel ladies busied themselves with lace and lamp oil, it was a far less risque business matter, taking place just beyond the velvet curtains in the private sitting room. Now, this may come as a surprise, especially if you've always imagined saloon girls flitting about with nothing more on their minds than rouge and ruffles, but many brothels in the Old West doubled quite effectively as informal banks. You see, the ladies upstairs weren't just in the business of pleasure. They were adept at interest rates, I owe us, and keeping ledgers, albeit written in discreet shorthand no outsider could dare decipher. After all, one doesn't survive long in a town full of gamblers and outlaws without knowing how to balance a budget with the cunning of a poker cheat and the grace of a tightrope walker. Madame Eloise, in particular, had the uncanny knack for knowing which rancher's loan to float and which local mine owner to politely deny. She didn't need to crunch numbers. She read people the way others read newspapers, with just a glance and a squinted eye. Local blacksmith needs to buy new tools but can't pay up front. Eloise knew he'd repay with trade and loyalty. Traveling salesman looking to borrow gold for a sure-thing investment in collapsible tin buckets. She'd send him on his merry and most collapsible way. And make no mistake, these financial dealings weren't done behind backs. The town sheriff likely had an outstanding tab. The mayor would send updates on regional market trends, and the store owner's bookkeeping improved markedly after a few late-night accounting consultations with Eloise's top girl Clara, who happened to be unusually literate and suspiciously fast at arithmetic. While the local bank, if the town had one, sputtered and groaned through each economic hiccup like a cantankerous mule, the brothel's finances flowed as smoothly as aged whiskey. This was partly because women like Eloise didn't gamble their siege profits. They saved, stashed, and knew precisely who was trustworthy and who was, how shall we say it, economically allergic to honesty. Underneath Madame Eloise's bed, strategically nailed to the floor to prevent accidental borrowing, were tin boxes filled with coins, deeds, and bundles of folded ledger pages. Some were written in French, others in a cheerful but impenetrable mimicry of legalese. These weren't just savings, they were influence. Owning the mortgage to the town's only newspaper had advantages, especially when it came to avoiding rumors and enhancing reputations with quantifiable flair. One time, when the town's fledgling bank nearly went bust due to an unwise investment in a mule-drawn trolley line, it was money from the upstairs of Madame Eloise's establishment that quietly kept the payroll flowing. Of course, no official record of that bailout exists, but the banker always tipped his hat a little lower and blushed considerably more deeply whenever he passed that grand house of rosy windows. The irony of it all is delightful, really. That the most stable financial institution in many a Wild West town wore lace gloves, burned sweet oil lamps, and served its clients both champagne and fiscal solvency. Well, that's about as frontier as it gets. Not that all brothel bankers were so genteel. Some, especially in rowdier territories, employed burly women named something like Shotgun Nellie, who collected debts with a smile and a hint of visible pistol. But the principle remained. Brothels weren't just central to the economy. They were the economy, with better hours and more lenient dress codes. So next time you think of the Old West and picture dusty boots clomping into saloons or gold pans glinting beside icy streams, spare a thought for the madams and their money-laden boudoir, where dreams were traded, fortunes made, and dusty ledgers whispered secrets long after the candles had burned low. And just as the last flickers of oil lamps wink through the lace-curtained windows, let's glide softly onward to a place where influence wasn't just bought in silver, but spun in silk and sealed with a knowing gaze. If you found yourself strolling into a dusty frontier town in, say, 1884, perhaps Dodge City, Deadwood, or one of those places with a name that sounds like it's been through 3 gunfights and 1 branding, you might think the sheriff ran things, or the mayor, or some whisker-faced banker hunched over a dusty ledger, but no. chances are the real power sat behind velvet curtains, sipping a cup of brandy and wearing a corset tighter than civic bureaucracy. The madams, dear listener, weren't just managing their social houses, as the polite euphemism went. They were quietly managing everything else too. Take the curious case of Miss Fanny Porter of San Antonio. By all outward appearances, a woman with a lace-trimmed parlor and a questionable guest list. But peek just a little closer, and you'd find she was also the unofficial HR department of the even less official underworld. Fanny hosted the likes of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, not because she liked living dangerously, though she might have, but because she was a shrewd businesswoman. She offered refuge, information, and sometimes an impromptu supply chain for outlaw operations. And here's the delicious twist. Lawmen knew about it. Many of them were regular visitors. Fanny ran her establishment like a diplomatic embassy, neutral ground, slightly perfumed. One of the primary reasons these brothels held such sway was simple. They kept the peace, sometimes more effectively than the official authorities. Drunk cowboys with itchy trigger fingers were far less likely to start barroom brawls after an evening of songs, soft lighting, and someone calling them darlin'. If the sheriff cracked down too harshly on the brothels, he might find the saloons picketless, the streets louder, and the hotel sheets missing. Everything was connected, like an extremely dusty spiderweb. And then there was the money. Oh, the money. Not many people realized that some frontier madams possessed liquid capital that would make the town bankers monocle fog with envy. With it, they invested, lent, and bribed. They paid for school renovations and church steeples, supplied meals during bad winters, and were sometimes the only people in town who paid in full and on time. One brothel in Helena, Montana, was known to have better bookkeeping than the state treasury. Most madams kept meticulous records, not necessarily because they feared audits, though one never knows when a territorial accountant might ride into town, but because reputation was everything. A madam with a trustworthy ledger was one whose girls stayed longer, whose clients paid better, and whose influence grew quieter and wider with each passing season. Now, you may be wondering, didn't people object? Surely someone must have protested that vice was holding up the town hall. Indeed, objections were made. Ministers preached. Temperance groups clutched pearls. Letters were written in stern penmanship. But conveniently, many of these same critics were somehow funded by anonymous donations that just happened to coincide with Sunday collections becoming suspiciously generous. One mining town in Colorado had its entire library funded by a madam named Pearl DeVere. She even insisted the library include a children's section, ostensibly to provide cultural uplift, and perhaps to distract people from the fact that her own reading room was often lit by red lanterns. But things weren't all silk and sassafras. These women walked a narrow path. Their power was real, but delicate. Too flashy, and they'd draw the wrath of moral crusaders. Too quiet, and they'd be forgotten when things went sideways. It was a balancing act on a swaying wooden plank, with petticoats billowing in the wind. Still, they persisted. They mastered charm and politics, ledger books and social maneuvering. Their influence didn't come from a badge or a bank. It came from something far more potent, necessity. And as the dust of history continues to settle on those frontier towns, a curious pattern emerges. Wherever there was a booming economy, a gold rush, a railroad hub, or just a whole bunch of lonely men with paychecks, there inevitably was a parlor lit softly in the corner of town, quietly steering the wheel while everyone thought the mayor was driving. But what happened when the frontier towns started to civilize, when the velvet curtains were drawn for the last time, and the brothel lights faded? Ah, now that, my dear listener, is its own shadowed story, one that's just coming into view, while most folks think of brothels as just a sideline to the saloons and shootouts of the American frontier. Those painted ladies, or as they prefer to be called, soiled doves, a poetic euphemism if there ever was one, were actually some of the most effective real estate investors, community organizers, and security coordinators the West had ever seen. It's the kind of thing that never made it into school textbooks, though perhaps it should have. Just imagine how much more attentive middle schoolers would have been if Business Management 101 with Madame Lulu was part of the curriculum. By the late 1800s, in gold rush towns from Deadwood to Dodge City, a surprising number of brothels weren't just renting rooms, they were buying entire buildings. You see, while most miners and cowboys came and went with empty pockets and dusty boots, madams saved. Carefully, strategically, and with one eye always on the next boomtown over. They were among the few in the West who believed in retirement planning and urban development, two concepts generally unheard of among gunfighters and gamblers. Let us drop in on one such paragon of industry, Josephine. Bank account Joe Malone. A madam in Tombstone with a flair for pearl buttons and property deeds. Josephine started out humbly, managing a second-floor parlor with creaky stairs and questionable insulation. But one ledger, and a few loans later, she quietly acquired the mortgage on the general store below her, and then, in an elegant twist of frontier irony, began charging the sheriff rent. By 1886, she effectively owned half a block, one dance hall, and a church she mused about turning into a very tasteful boarding house. Now, how did they pull this off so inconspicuously? It helped that women, particularly those working in discreet industries, weren't exactly expected to shuffle into the local bank and start rattling off investment strategies. So while everyone was busy side-eyeing the saloon barker, these women were quietly becoming the financial backbone of the whole operation. Property passed through aliases, trusts, or occasionally, an unsuspecting dentist who didn't ask too many questions. Legal loopholes. Oh, they knew them better than any judge sipping warmed whiskey in a rocking chair. In fact, some of these madams became so prominent in their local economies that town officials would consult them, privately of course, before undertaking public projects. Roads needed grading. Speak with Miss Violet. She knows the land. A new water pump required? Madame Clarice had the funds and the influence, and she was surprisingly passionate about access to reliable plumbing. And they weren't just buying property. They were securing talent, establishing supply chains, and investing in comfort-enhancing technologies. Things like double-paned windows, imported fabrics, and indoor heating mechanisms that made rugged frontier life just a pinch more bearable. In many ways, brothels were the first true, multi-service establishments of the American West. Yes, there was the usual nightly entertainment, but patrons could also indulge in hot baths, fresh meals, dental extraction, often administered by enthusiastic but wholly unlicensed practitioners, and the occasional poetry reading, depending on the clientele. The key was discretion. These women knew how to run an empire in silk slippers, not spurs. Many registered their businesses under vague names like Convalescent House, Seamstress Boarding, or the slightly too obvious Wilhelmina's Academy for Gentle House Skills. The real name of the game wasn't seduction, it was sustainability. And perhaps strangest of all, brothels often had better security than the local jail. They hired off-duty marshals, former Pinkertons, and, on one peculiar occasion in Arizona, a retired opera tenor with a mustache so wide it served as both disguise and deterrent. These places had logs, ledgers, and backup candle supplies. They were fortresses with wallpaper. Color coordinated naturally. So much of the American West was built on gamble and grit. But in the corners of these dusty towns, tucked behind velvet curtains and layers of social denial, a different kind of grit was at work. The kind that wore perfume, counted coins by candlelight, and made sure that the piano stayed tuned even when the bullets flew. And just as the moonlight settles over the sloped rooftops of an old frontier street, reflecting off tin signs and traces of perfume in the breeze, there remains one more curious little corner of brothel life we've yet to explore. One that involves temperance unions, highly persuasive madams, and an unexpected crossover with the world of early town politics. While the smoky saloons and wobbling spittoons of the Old West keep stealing the spotlight, it's easy to forget that money didn't just gallop into town on horseback. It walked in wearing corsets, and it deposited coins 1 nickel at a time. By the late 1800s, frontier towns, from dusty Deadwood to clinking El Paso, were often more economically balanced on red velvet parlors than on gold dust or silver nuggets. Somewhere between civilization and chaos, the elite brothels began acting like economic engines, civic institutions, and rather unexpectedly, financial rescue squads. You see, the madams, those formidable corseted CEOs of the flesh industry, had evolved into something akin to shadow mayors, elected not with ballots, but with envelopes of cash, charitable donations, and the occasional whispered favor over brandy. Their benevolence wasn't just strategic, it was often essential, especially when the town needed a new school roof or, say, to not go bankrupt before Wednesday. Take, for example, the case of Mattie Silks in Denver, a woman with a flair for velvet drapery and a ledger book sharper than any deputy's pistol. Mattie, who ran one of Denver's most financially successful brothels, regularly loaned large sums to the city under the table. She understood interest rates better than most bankers and still had the time to host poetry, readings on Thursdays. True story, or at least within the poetic boundary of the era's gossip. And it wasn't just Denver. All over the West, taxes on brothels, fines from the occasional public disturbance, and generous political donations, often written down as donations to the town's cultural initiative fund, kept many municipal budgets afloat. Sheriff's office out of bullets. Ask Miss Ruby down the way. Need a new firehouse. Madame Josephine likely already organized a benefit ball with optional masks. Behind those silk curtains, ledgers were meticulously kept, fees standardized, and negotiations with city officials handled with a diplomacy rarely seen in the town's actual courthouse. In fact, many of the first social services, from feeding the poor to bailing out families during bad harvests, were quietly bankrolled by the very houses the newspapers refused to name. It's deliciously ironic. The buildings dubbed dens of sin ended up underwriting most of the public decency. On quieter evenings, you might imagine a madam sitting in her office, surrounded by accounts books and gleaming oil lamps, calculating out this month's charitable giving alongside payroll and whiskey deliveries. Dogs barked outside. The piano played a slow ragtime 2 rooms over, and somewhere in the background, someone was almost certainly being thrown out of a saloon for playing poker with 5 aces. And still, the madam summoned the clerk. "Be a dear and send $50 to the school board," she'd say, lightly, sipping a brandy. "Tell them it's for the chalk shortage." Again, these quiet civic contributions weren't talked about in polite daytime conversation. But everyone knew where the funds came from when the clock tower was repaired or the town's children went home with new shoes. As towns matured, or tried to, many civic leaders wanted to shoo the brothels out to the wrong side of the tracks, tidy things up for the approaching railroads and bankers. But here's the thing about self-appointed moral high ground. It's hard to maintain when you owe someone several months' back taxes, and they're technically the reason the courthouse has a roof. Even when public pressure forced red light districts into the shadows, the ladies inside were rarely forgotten. Their influence lingered not just in accounts payable, but in downtown boulevards, schoolhouses, and even some of the region's first hospitals. Occasionally founded with money from the exact kind of place the hospital politely pretended not to know existed. Some madams purchased land, invested in real estate, then turned quietly into landlords for half the men who'd once clutched their hats nervously in their parlors. Entangled in the economy with a neatness only capitalist irony can offer, the brothel became less of a place and more of an institution, essential, if officially unmentionable. Of course, all empires shift shape, even the silk-lined ones. Soon enough, changing laws, railroad influence, and the slow crawl toward prohibition would challenge these hidden town hall presidents and financial fairy godmothers. But oh, they put up a fight. Corseted, witty, and armed with balance sheets sharper than a gambler's Bowie knife. The Old West may have ridden into legend on the backs of lawmen and desperados, but it turns out, between the glittering whiskey glasses and stacks of silver coins, The real power might have worn perfume and signed property deeds. And as the oil lamps flicker low in our memory of those velvety nights, there's just one more tale to tell. How the whole empire of silk and secrecy came undone. Quietly, stubbornly, and with at least one feathered hat left defiantly askew. The lights in the saloon are dim now, lantern wicks pinched down to a sleepy flicker. Boots thunk quietly against wooden floorboards as the last card game winds down, and a lone harmonica sighs softly from the porch outside. The Wild West has yawned, stretched, and turned in for the night, and tucked behind those swinging saloon doors, still faintly creaking to the rhythm of some forgotten polka tune, lies one of the most misremembered centers of power in the American frontier, the brothel. By now you know the westward expansion was less about dramatic duels and dirt-covered outlaws, and more about cold beans, land speculation, and resilient women in silk corsets with ledgers in their drawers and politics on their lips. You see, even when the drunken cowpokes stumbled down the boardwalk mumbling about gold and justice, it was often the madam, watching through lace curtains, who already knew exactly how the town council vote would go because she hosted it over brandy and biscuits 2 nights ago upstairs. In many towns, the brothel wasn't just tolerated, it was essential. When municipal governments were still figuring out how to order street lamps, it was the soiled doves and their bosses who each quietly bankrolled the infrastructure. Taxes. Try donations from the Pioneer Ladies Benevolent Protection Society, which, surprise, was often a polite rebranding of the local red light elite. Need a schoolhouse, some curtains for the church, a new well dug before the water gave everyone the trots. Well, if consensus couldn't be found in the parlor of the mayor, it was surely secured in the parlor of Madame Eloise, over a fine cut of ham and a decanter of whiskey, better than anything the general store clerk dared offer. It's a curious irony. The so-called respectable folk built towns with sawdust and sermons, but it was the scarlet districts that kept the paper flowing and the ink wet. Because when no one else understood supply chains, credit systems, or negotiation, the brothel's accounting books did, and they were written in perfect penmanship. Some of these madams went far beyond the bedroom suite. Take Madame Dora Dufran of Deadwood, South Dakota. She was basically the Chamber of Commerce in a bustle. She employed dozens, ran legal businesses, backed political candidates, and once famously turned down Calamity Jane as an employee, a fact that suggests she had quality standards and perhaps a healthy distrust of whiskey-fueled gunplay during client visits. Wise, that Dora. Or consider Josephine Airy, who arrived penniless in Idaho and by sheer determination and a strategically placed mirror collection became Liberty Belle, one of the wealthiest women in the territory. She later left the profession but remained a local legend, proving that empowerment sometimes wore petticoats and carried a cash box. At night, when the sightseers had retired and the last mule was too tired to bray, women like Josephine would sneak meetings with ranchers, bankers, mayors, not all in the same evening, mind you. Even they had office hours, and slowly nudged the town toward a strange kind of civility. One financed with desires but managed with spreadsheets. Sure, there were difficulties, judgment from outsiders, legislation aimed squarely at their doors, occasional fires. Brothels had an uncanny habit of burning down, usually right before a suspicious property sale. But through it all, these women endured, adapted, held the ledger and the gavel, if not always publicly. And eventually, of course, towns grew. Paths became roads. Vice got paved over with propriety, and the roles played by these women were quietly edited out of the historical playbill. We don't hear much about how a well-placed sigh and a silk-wrapped whisper changed a zoning law. But perhaps that's by design. A brothel, after all, was never just a place of pleasure. On the frontier, it could be city hall, social club, welfare office, and occasionally, if the piano player sobered up, an evening's entertainment too. So as the stars blink across the wide western sky and the curtains flutter gently in the midnight breeze, remember, Behind many of the most rugged towns and rigid sheriffs stood a velvet glove, guiding the hand, adjusting the collar, and refilling the coffers with a wink. Sleep now, wanderer. Let the echo of soft laughter and whispering chiffon guide you home through tumbleweed dreams. The West, wild as ever, grows quiet. Its secrets hum beneath the floorboards. And for now, they're yours to dream.